Okay, welcome to our first mix, the history of states. The history of states is largely a European story. The form of a state first evolved there, winning out over several competing forms, and then through colonialism and decolonization, the form spread elsewhere. Those regions that avoided colonization ended up adopting the form out of convenience because states had configured themselves and the system of relations they created between themselves to best interact with other states. To tell this story, we have to begin thinking at the tail end of the Roman Empire. In 285 AD, the Roman Empire was divided into an eastern half and a western half, designated by the two shades of pink here on this map, and between it had four emperors. It was simply too big to govern in its current configuration. It managed to persist in this weird eastern and western arrangement for about 80 years. Between pressures created by the corruption of the ruling class, increased attack from Germanic tribes, overextension of boundaries, and pressures created by one emperor's enthusiasm for spreading Christianity. Between all of these, the eastern half split off around 360 AD to become what was then called the Byzantine Empire. But the lack of the borders in the east and in the north, as you can see over here, the areas are really kind of only vaguely, let's just say the borders that are presented here are guesstimates and stretches rather than firm lines on a map as they are now. The migration period between roughly 376 to 476, better known to scholars as the Völkerwanderung, which is far more fun to say, leads to the collapse of most of the Western Empire. We see Huns coming out of Central Asia and into the Eastern Europe area. It's the black line around 370 or so. They displaced the Vandals, the Wandal in the green line here, who were already present. So what did the Vandals do? They go into the southern part of Central Europe through France, eventually work their way down through Spain and back around. And the Huns had also displaced the Visigoths as well, and similarly. So large groups of Goth and Huns moved down into Central Europe, what had previously been the heart of the Western Roman Empire. The Roman legions at this point are withdrawing closer to home as imperial civil wars are becoming more and more common and invaders are getting closer to the imperial capital. Britain, for example, was abandoned by Roman legions between 406 and 410. Vandals crossed the Rhine River, which was another kind of traditional boundary of the Roman Empire in 406. They take Spain by 409. The Goths sack Rome in 410, and the Vandals sack it again in 455. What happens during this period is the assorted invaders simply adopt the boundaries, titles, and styles of the Roman provincial units they had conquered, though without the additional layer of political control that the empire itself had exerted. We see during this period that fragmentation in the Western in the Western Empire in particular collapses. Italy is convulsing under civil wars as what's left of the Roman Empire disintegrates internally. The new rulers who took over these former Roman provinces lacked administrative skills to keep them working at the same level that the Romans had, and in most cases they often lacked basic literacy. What this meant is that to administer the provinces they had conquered, they now depended on the services of literate individuals, who in most cases were trained by the church. The Eastern Empire that we see down over here, just as a side note, lives on for quite some time at least technically lives on until 1453 when Constantinople gets sacked by Muslims. So, by the time we get to about 1000 AD, there are a few things to note about how Europe looks as we emerge from what the West at least knows as the Dark Ages. We see significant Islamic presence in the lands that were formerly part of the Roman Empire, and particularly in the areas that are now part of the So we'll move forward a little bit here into about 1200. Notice the huge number of entities that exist at this point. This map here on the right shows the major units that were recognized amongst themselves as more or less equals. The second map here zooms into the area marked with the red dashed box. You'll see subunits within each of these units. So they technically look, at least on the map on the right, like they might be unified countries. That's really quite misleading. You'll see that each of them is comprised of many, many subunits. Each of these subunits that's marked in here has a major noble, a duke, a count, some cases a prince or a bishop, who ruled it. So if you look below this fine red line that's dashed in down here in the Holy Roman Empire, you'll see the Kingdom of Burgundy here on the left and the Kingdom of Indic over here on the right. You'll notice that each of those still has colored markings within it. The Duchy of Savoy, which is this pink bit over here, straddles the boundary between the two units, and the Duke of Savoy is beholden to both the dukes of, I believe they're dukes of Burgundy. It's definitely the Duke of Burgundy, and I'm not sure what the ruler of Indic was named himself. The Kingdom of Bohemia constitutes a significant part of the eastern part of the Holy Roman Empire over here. Its king was one of the 7 prince-electors of the Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Empire is actually an elected, the post of Holy Roman Emperor is actually an elected position. Being one of the electors is a very lucrative position. The bribes are fantastic. In the early 1300s, the Holy Roman Emperor himself was a vassal of the King of France, who also happened to be the King of Navarre, which we saw over here through his mother's side. But you'll notice even the thing that looks like France, and at this point he is calling himself the King of France, contain many, many different subunits. At this point, they've stopped calling himself the King of the Franks and is now the King of France. Contains significant chunks of territory belonging to the English crown. It also contains the rather oddly discontinuous Duchy of Blois-Champagne, and the extensive lands of the Duchy or Comté of Toulouse down over here in the south, plus the Duchy of Flanders in the north that is split between France and the Holy Roman Empire. So this giant unit up north in England is just below Scotland. That's the Duchy of York. At one point, the Dukes of York become the Kings of England, become the ruling family of England. As you probably gathered from that previous spiel, by the time we get to the Middle Ages, roughly 1100 to 1400 CE, we see a phenomenal proliferation of units and strange overlapping entities, for lack of a better word. There is, at this point, a growing re-centralization of political power. Not to the extent that we saw under the Romans, but still definitely re-centralizing after the highly fragmentary years of the Dark Ages. This is the period when we see the height of feudalism as a system of political organization. Feudalism is a set of obligations owed to one's lord, but with a parallel and often financially less onerous set of obligation owed by the lord to the liege. So you owed homage, which is the responsibility to provide armed and equipped men for the lord's military campaigns, to pay taxes, to enforce the lord's laws, etc. The lord has an obligation to protect the vassal from any inside or outside encroachment, to render justice, especially vis-a-vis other nobles, to help in times of need such as famine and drought or whatever. Obligations overlap. Your lord has several lieges, but is in turn the liege of a higher lord, up to the king. The kings are, at least in theory, God's lieges on earth, and so at least in spiritual matters they're beholden to the Pope, who is himself a feudal overlord for those holding lands in the Papal States in central Italy. Lots of fun there. Bishops and abbots were often landlords, which is to say they effectively held civil rank as well as religious. We do see an important role for security concerns here, driving this consolidation, not least driven by the introduction of gunpowder in about 1250. Previous forms of defenses at this point had often been relatively thin walls, relatively simple, still often just wooden palisades and a moat. Gunpowder is used primarily for cannon at this point. That means you need bigger and thicker castle walls. At the early part of this medieval period, a wooden palisade was sufficient, but by the end of this, you needed stone and lots of it, right? This is the period of the rise of the fortified castles, the classic walled, moated, turreted medieval variety that you picture if you think castle, right? Stone's a lot more expensive to get and build with. Remember, most of Europe is covered by forests at this point, so only wealthier lords could do it. And how did you become wealthy? You became lord over a lot of land and had lots of tax-paying peasants. If you're a lord and your land isn't large enough to support the building of adequate defenses, then you end up becoming the vassal of a more powerful lord and contributing to his defense. He in return contributes to yours. So we see the rise of larger and larger political units, at least partly as a function of changes in military technology that increase the cost of defensive fortifications. We also see during this period a growing power of the Catholic Church, and in particular issues with secular and religious authority. Bishops and abbots are often landlords and share responsibility for governance and security in the towns that grow up around monasteries and around cathedral towns. In some cases, the bishops in particular control large swaths of land that were bequeathed to the church. So conflict arises over who should appoint bishops, the king or the pope or the religious hierarchy. The civil power that bishops wield is significant and can't be dismissed. So the result is a string of what are called investiture crises all over Western Europe, where kings are refusing to confirm bishops that the Pope or the hierarchy had otherwise nominated. Finally, we see some deconsolidation of units outside Western Europe. Particularly the Eastern Roman Empire, what was left of it, starts to begin to disintegrate at this point. In 1054, a schism split the Eastern Church, what became the Byzantine Church, away from what is now the Roman Catholic Church. So the Crusades that then went to the Holy Land after this point, particularly by about 1204, the Crusades also mean protecting Constantinople, or at least protecting the rights of Latin Rite worshippers, Roman Catholics, in the whole Eastern Roman Empire. The siege of Constantinople in 1204 by Knights of the Second Crusade effectively destroyed the Byzantine Empire. This had strategic as well as religious reasons for doing these things, but the result is that the Byzantine Empire largely collapses, and we see significant encroachment by Islamic forces during this period. That brings us up to the next major milestones in terms of talking about the development of what we see as states. To understand how this evolves, though, we have to step back to 1066, when William the Conqueror conquers England. And he was Duke of Normandy. When he took the English crown in 1066, he retained his Norman possessions and the feudal obligations that he owed to the King of France, well, who was then calling himself the King of the Franks, but that's a different story. So William conquers militarily almost all of England, right? Not Great Britain. He didn't conquer Scotland or Wales, but he does conquer England and created a unified political unit under Norman nobles, right, imported from France rather than the local Anglo nobility, who owed him their loyalty. By the mid-1300s, most Norman nobles had estates in both England and France, and the Normandy region of France benefited more from trade with England across the Channel than from trade with the rest of France via the Seine. Then Henry II of England marries Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor's an only child, and she inherits her father's lands when he died. So the kings of England now owe homage to the kings of France for lands in France, not only the Norman possessions, but also the rather wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine. War over these possessions certainly starts earlier than the 1337 noted here, which is the recognized start date of the so-called 100 Years' War. In an earlier battle, Philip II of France, who was, by the way, the first to call him King of France rather than King of the Franks, in 1214 he defeats the forces of John II of England. It causes John's barons to revolt, and results eventually in 1215 in John signing the Magna Carta, which then sets England on the path that we know as modern representative democracy. France, so back to the main story here. France grows as an accretion of dukedoms and kingdoms over time. It leads to a patchwork of local taxation laws. England was one homogeneous unit thanks to William's military conquest of all of it. France, on the other hand, is a patchwork quilt. All of the various component regions have distinct taxation regimes and privileges and rights that in most cases persist up to 1789, and actually they're a significant part of what contributes to the crown's fiscal crisis that prompts the revolution, and why England starts, it's also related to why England starts the Industrial Revolution instead of the nominally wealthier per capita France, but that's another lecture that I'll give later in the term. So in any case, we combine different rules of heredity. England passes the crown to the closest male relative, but French Salic law requires it to be the closest male relative in the male line. So when Charles IV of France dies in 1328 without a male heir, English kings take advantage and start pressing their claim, and this is the start of what becomes the 100-Year War. The French king Jean II is captured in 1356 at the Battle of Poitiers, along with about 2,000 of his nobles. Most of them are ransomed back to France at a cost of about a third of France's GDP. It's absolutely ruinous to the local economy in France. As a result, John, to try to stabilize national finances, good heavens, and to get the economy moving again, introduces a new currency, the franc, to try to restore some confidence in the economy. The side effect of this is to wipe out local and regional currencies. So that's good for the central government. The central government at this point, as we said, is very much governing a patchwork of regions, each of which has separate rights and rules and things like that. Anyway, making war for 100 years is expensive. War requires that the war maker, the leader, mobilize resources. And as the cost of making war goes up, which it does over time, the resource demands increase. That requires developing an effective system for extracting resources from the public, which means development of domestic bureaucratic infrastructure to collect and manage taxation. The result of building armies that are paid by the central government is that all the guys with weapons who know how to use them are paid by the king, so they're presumably loyal to him. Building an effective standing army, or at least a functional standing defense, weakens the needs of regional magnates, right? Those regional nobles, to have their own armed forces loyal to themselves. It helps too that that both of these states develop some type of legitimacy philosophy, right? In England, it's through representation, and there's a little bit of attempt at a representative function in France. But France primarily during this point starts to evolve a philosophy of absolutism and the divine right of kings. Both of these encourage your population to obey you and to pay taxes without you having to exert additional force on them to compel their behavior. As a result, we see England and France emerge during this period as the first proto-states. They end up beginning toward the end of this period, starting to look like things that we now recognize as states. Now, it's important to note at this point that alternatives to states coexist alongside these early proto-states. City-states are one of those options. They're mostly in Italy, consisting of a mother city and its surrounding hinterland, which is often itself composed of small cities and towns. Venice and Florence are our best examples of these. The hinterland areas used the currency, the weights and measures, and legal codes of the mother city, while the mother city provides protection and law and order. It's clearly one dominant city which rules over its countryside. There's also the option of city leagues. You'll see a map here of one of the most famous of those. Often cities in the Holy Roman Empire would do this, mostly in Germany, but it was a particularly Northern European kind of phenomenon. The one you see over here is the Hanseatic League, known as the Hansa in German. The Hansa is a league of trading states. Created in 1159, formally organized 1356, heavily active until about the mid-1600s, so say about 3 centuries, and not formally dissolved until 1862. The Hansa had its own diet, which is to say a quasi-legislature type thing, which met regularly until 1669 to determine policies for the group. It had its own code of merchanting law. The members furnished troops and ships for mutual protection. This is clearly not a geographically unified thing. You'll see that it ranges from Kiev out here in modern-day Ukraine up to Edinburgh, down to Marseille, and up to Trondheim in Norway. Cities also enter and leave the league over time. Moreover, on top of this, many of these cities, most of them actually, are members of are parts of the Holy Roman Empire. Others are within some of these proto-states of France, England, and Sweden. As the proto-states consolidate, the Hansa is often pushed out. It's expelled from its last enclave in modern Russia in 1494, and from London in 1597 among heavy pressure from local merchants about the taxes and other privileges granted to Hansa merchants, but denied to them. So the City League is another option for organization that does not involve states. Then we have the Holy Roman Empire. It is comprised by, we're talking early 1500s or so here, several hundred different entities that range from duchies and counties and kingdoms to independent free imperial cities, and of all sorts of other units. There are, one scholar counted at least 14 different types of units comprising it at this point. It had a constitution which spelled out the 7 official electors of the Holy Roman Emperor. These guys were eligible to vote to select the emperor. The constitution also defined what obligations the various units owed to the emperor, as well as what privileges they received. It's important to note this is not a single organized constitution in the sense that the American Constitution is. It's often treaties and agreements between the Holy Roman Empire and the various individual components rather than a collectively negotiated thing. So those are the options that coexist in the mid-1400s, early 1500s that could have been the formation or could have been the modern world. But instead we end up with states. So why? The Reformation starts in 1517 with Martin Luther's publication of the 95 Theses that become the basis of Protestant theology. It puts significant pressure on multi-unit agglomerations, for lack of a better word, especially here the Holy Roman Empire. Leaders can gain many, many advantages by adopting Protestantism, no matter what they actually think about salvation and sacraments and grace and faith. The biggest thing they can do is weaken the power of the church and in their affairs. The popes and the bishops had significant power and influence, even on day-to-day kinds of things. When the faithful die, they often will some or even all of their money and land to the church. So in most states, the Catholic Church is wealthy and powerful. It holds a lot of land and doesn't pay taxes. So nationalizing the church, which is effectively what Protestant is in the early days, where the leader of the church in your country becomes someone in your country, not the Pope, is a great thing for the state's treasury. It's even greater that the Protestant ethic is largely about lack of ostentation. So all of the fancy gold things and the expensive things from Catholics are, of course, seized by the state because, of course, who needs those in a Protestant country anyway? So we'll just melt them down and oh, look, they turn into currency. Gold's a great thing. Anyway, the decision to adopt Protestantism also allows the appointment of new people as bishops and other leaders in the new church hierarchy. The leader, of course, is the one doing the appointing, so he can pick people who are loyal to him, who will advance his interests the most, and or who give him the biggest bribes. So there are lots of incentives here for leaders of these various subunits of the Holy Roman Empire to assert independence, right? These incentives affect proto-states too. Henry Tudor of England, Henry VIII, split from the Catholic Church, at least in part because the doctrines proposed by Protestantism allowed him justification, or the ability, rather, to divorce the wife that he was displeased with, who hadn't been able to give him an heir, and marry the girl who'd caught his eye, Anne Boleyn, right? Religious pressure, the wars of religion that accompany this, most notably the so-called 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, continue pressure on leaders to raise funds to fight the wars, right? It's further incentives centralizing control of fiscal functions, standing armies, etc. The short form of this, though, is the continuous conflicts between England and France from the early 1200s through the mid-1600s, to a lesser extent involving the Habsburg Empire. The Habsburgs currently, through much of this period, hold the Holy Roman are the Holy Roman Emperors. They have imperial space in both Spain and Austria. It builds an infrastructure in these states that becomes very close to what we now know as a modern state, right? 4 centuries of mobilizing fiscal and human resources developed the machinery to administer a modern state and be that highest domestic authority. And it consolidated both borders and mechanisms for inter-unit interaction. Here we go. Here's the other map I was looking for, wondering why it didn't pop up. This is a map of all of the components of the Holy Roman Empire in the 1648 kind of era. You'll see all of the purple areas are bishoprics. They're controlled directly by church leaders. The Habsburgs rule the green areas over here and the yellow areas over here. There's gazillions of kind of entities. The colors here represent who rules them rather than anything about components, but it gives you some idea of the complexity of this. So, the treaties that end the war of religion, the wars of religion, the treaty that ends the 30 Years' War, are the Treaties of Westphalia, signed in 1648. That is a crucial date. We normally date the creation of the modern state system to these treaties, though as we've seen, many of the key defining characteristics are developing gradually over the last several centuries. We see the first thinkers writing about the notion of sovereignty and the role of the state as early as the 1640s, when Thomas Hobbes writes the Leviathan. Right? His notion of the role of the state is greatly influenced by the collapse of internal sovereignty during the English Civil Wars of 1642 to 51. The Treaties of Westphalia, sometimes expressed as the Treaty Singular of Westphalia, though that's not technically correct, express this emerging doctrine of the period. Right? There are 2 major principles: internal sovereignty, which is meaning non-interference, each state is the highest authority in its own territory, and external sovereignty, which is mutual recognition of other units as equals. So let's start with internal sovereignty. The Peace of Augsburg, which ended one of the other conflicts of the Wars of Religion in 1555, developed the formula cuius regio eius religio, whoever rules has religion, right? Leaders have the right to determine their state's own, the religion of their state, with both Protestantism and Catholicism recognized as valid. All parties at these peace talks, including some who weren't signatories to Augsburg, agree to uphold this principle. In other words, each leader is internally supreme in all matters, even those of faith. Right? The second principle, external sovereignty, is a general recognition of each leader's exclusive right to command and make laws for his lands, peoples, and agents abroad. Each leader has this right just as much as any other leader, regardless of his title or size of territory. In other words, all states are externally equals, which when combined with the first principle of internal sovereignty implies that non-intervention becomes the norm, and rulerships in one's own domain is exclusive. So they signed two treaties, one in Osnabrück, which is here on the left, and that was signed by the Protestants. The one on the right here is signed by the Catholics in Münster, because the two sides were unwilling to meet. The treaties were signed by a total of 194 entities. Negotiations were facilitated by a papal nuncio or ambassador. The documents are identical. They're written in German. Latin was the official language of the Catholic Church and the primary language of official diplomacy at the time. The use of anything other than Latin for official treaties was still nearly unheard of, and that fact alone speaks volumes about the importance of this document to the signatories and the incredibly weak position of the Pope. So, revisiting the definition of a state. States have permanent population. Check. This distinguishes them from distinguishes empires and states from pre-imperial nomadic tribes. Territory has boundaries. Bounded territory distinguishes states from empires, whose boundaries were typically fluid and ill-defined. Imperial authority faded rather than stopped at a boundary. Third, they have internal sovereignty, in which the state is the highest authority and makes decisions for its own population without the interference of others. After 1648, this is recognized as a principle, so check. Finally, external sovereignty, principle of mutual recognition as equals, that each of them has equal rights to the regardless of the size of their territory or the nominal title of their leaders. After 1648, check.